I can't explain it, but he's been here the whole time. No one believed me. My wife thought I was insane, but he's been here the whole time. My son, Dale, was 5 when he went missing. We were at the park by our flat when it happened. Park may be too grand a word for it, but that's what Dale always called it. In reality, it was a big plastic play structure with a couple of slides, a climbing wall, and a sand pit. The whole thing is surrounded by a 15 by 15 fence with a couple of benches for parents to sit on inside. That's where I sat that day, scrolling through Reddit and finishing my cigarette. Dale was playing with a couple of neighborhood kids, their parents sitting on the other benches, so they didn't have to breathe in my smoke. I looked up in time to see him go beneath the play structure, into an area they call the cave. The cave is an enclosed area beneath the structure, with a roof that was comfortably close for a kid and downright claustrophobic for an adult. I heard my phone chirp and looked back down to see a text from my wife. She'd gotten home from work and wanted Dale and me to come help with the groceries. I pitched my cigarette over the fence and called for Dale. "Come on, Dale. Mom's waiting for us." No response. "Come on, Dale. If you can't listen, we won't be able to come back tomorrow." Usually this would have brought him running. Playing outside was his favorite pastime, but there was still no answer. Both of his playmates came out the other side, giggling and laughing as they acted out whatever game they were playing, and I asked if they'd seen Dale. Alicia, a dark-haired girl who was missing her front teeth, lisped, "He's still in the cave, Mr. Darwith." So, I hunkered my nearly 6-foot frame, looked into the dark underbelly of the play structure, and called for Dale to come out. "Come on, Dale, we really have to go. Mom's waiting on us." I still didn't think anything was amiss, other than Dale trying to squeeze in a few more minutes of playtime. I expected him to giggle and poke his head out, baiting me into chasing him or crawling into the cave. He knew that as big as I was, it would be funny to watch me try to get under the structure and run him out, a game we played often. Instead, there was only silence. So I sighed and hunkered down on the damp sand to crawl under to get him. I heard the other 2 parents chuckle as they watched me, my back scraping at the bottom of the structure as I crawled towards the entrance to the cave. I didn't mind playing with Dale, but this was a little much. I was tired from my night shift the day before, and my back was sore from lifting freight all night. I resigned myself to having a stern talking to with him on the way home about not listening and crawled into the dark opening of the cave. As I passed from the lighted world outside, the afternoon sun cut slants across my face through the boards of the structure as I entered the darkness of the cave. I felt a crawling sensation on my neck suddenly. I thought I might have picked up a spider, and I ran a hand over to knock him off. There was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't abate. It felt like my hackles were up, that ancient feeling of predators nearby putting me on edge, and it took everything I had to keep dragging myself through the space. It was only about 5 feet of blackness, but the space was preternaturally dark. It was the weirdest I had felt in years. Was it always this dark in here? I'd crawled through here before, but I didn't remember it being this black. Worse still, I didn't feel like I was alone in here. Of course I'm not alone, I reminded myself. I came in here to get Dale. As I crawled through, I began to doubt that he was still in here, and the sense that something else lived here wouldn't so easily be put aside. I felt like something hateful lived here, something that was even now hungry and slobbering. My goal went from getting Dale to getting the hell out of the space, and I came out the other side, expecting to be dragged back and consumed any minute. I stood up, wiping the dirt off my knees, as the air puffed out of me loudly. It could have easily been mistaken for exertion, but I'd be a fool to pretend it was anything but fear. I expected my son to pop out and laugh at his silly old dad then, but he was still nowhere to be found. "Dale?" I called, my voice becoming fearful after what I'd experienced. "Dale!" The other parents looked up, hearing the jagged quality of my voice, and rose to see if everything was okay. I can't find my son," I told them, and they told me not to panic as we searched the structure. My wife came walking up just as I started getting frantic, and she must have sensed my concern as she caught sight of me. She called the police then, and as I ran to check the woods, I heard her say that hateful phrase for the first time. "Our son's gone missing. Please send help." Half an hour later, 2 cars pulled up and a couple of officers came to render assistance. I had searched behind the flats, in the scraggy woods nearby, around the little retention pond that I always told Dale to keep away from, and was just about to start knocking on doors when I saw them. They wanted to talk to me being the last to see Dale, and the officer in charge sent 2 of his men to check nearby houses as they asked me questions for the next few minutes. Where had I seen him? What was he wearing? Was there anyone suspicious around? Who were his mates? Where might he have gone off to? Did he run away often? And all the time they assured me that they would find him, and not to panic. I answered their questions honestly, but I knew that he couldn't have left the play park. Dale was small for his age. I told them so, and despite all my misgivings with the flat we lived in, they had done one thing that I thanked them for. The clasp on the gate was too heavy for a little tyke to push up. Dale had struggled with it before, but I knew he couldn't have left without help. The other parents said they hadn't seen him come out or seen anyone lurking around the playground that day. So the police searched. They searched the play park, the surrounding flats, the woods, and the whole area, basically retreading the ground I had already walked. As night began to fall, they called in more officers and began to canvass the wider area. My wife and I were distraught. Dale was our first and only child, but as the day stretched on, it seemed less and less likely that they would find him. I'm not ashamed to say that I took Dale's disappearance poorly. My wife was stoic through it all, but I knew she was hurting. He was her baby, and she had carried him for 9 months, but I think she held a lot of her sorrow in because she saw me floundering. I became like a ghost in my own home. Eventually I went back to work, but my performance suffered. It only takes a little effort to load things onto a truck, but I was falling behind, missing quotas, and making trucks late. The supervisor was a mate from primary school, fortunately for me, and he saw that I wasn't doing well. He suggested counseling and told me it might help, but I didn't want to tell some stranger about my problems. A year passed, my wife and I growing distant as the days went by, and as the anniversary of Dale's disappearance drew closer, I finally really screwed things up at work. I can't even say that it wasn't my fault, because it absolutely was. I was operating a lift, something I'd done since I got certified at 19, and as I backed out with a load, I hit a riser. It wasn't a hard hit, just a bump really, but the legs on that particular riser, as it turned out, were getting ready to give way. The riser collapsed in spectacular fashion, and when it fell on one of my co-workers. He lived. They managed to get the pallets off of him before they crushed him, but it broke his collarbone, and he had to be hospitalized. My supervisor was furious, but I could tell he was trying to hold back in the face of my sincere grief. "I'm recommending you take a couple of weeks unpaid leave. If it were anyone else, I'd hand them their walking papers here and now, but I know you need help more than you need a trip to the unemployment line. Take these 2 weeks, sort your life out, and return to work. If this happens again, mate, I ain't gonna have a choice." I couldn't look at him. His pity was worse than his anger, and I knew I needed to do something. I nodded, mumbling a thank you, and he showed me out of his office. I walked around for the rest of the night, trying to figure out what I was going to tell my wife, and finding nothing. She would be mad, probably mad enough to push her to leave me. But as the sun started to peek over the horizon, I knew there wasn't much else I could do. She was just as mad as I'd thought she'd be, but her pity was just as hard to look at as my supervisor's had been. He's gone. Dale is gone, and making yourself a martyr over it won't change the fact. You still have insurance. Get some counseling. Figure this out. I need you back. Not just back at work, but back here. I miss him too. But digging into these wounds won't make it any better. Get some help, for both our sakes." There was something unsaid beneath that statement, and I understood it, but wasn't sure what to do about it. I spent the next 4 days in a blackout state. I had found my therapy at the bottom of a bottle, something I had avoided up to that point. With no job to go to, I just stayed at home and drank my pain away. My wife's patience finally ran out. After 2 days of watching me hunker on the couch like a sot, she told me she was going to see her mother for a few days, and suggested I sort myself out while she was gone. "If I come home and you're still like this, I can't promise I'll be back for long." Once she was gone, I spent most of my day in a fermented haze. That's how, on the 5th day, I found myself buzzed and sitting on the same bench I had been on when I told Dale we needed to leave. It was early afternoon, and the play park was empty, thank God. It wasn't the first time I had just come to sit here, and the other parents often found excuses to leave with their kids when I came to wallow in my grief. I was the sad father who came back to the place he'd suffered most, and I really hoped the park had been empty when I got here. Even in my current state, I didn't want anyone to see me like this. It was embarrassing, and it might frighten some of the children if I came weaving into the park smelling like a distillery. I was staring at the play structure, thinking to myself that it might be time to get some help after all. When I first saw it, it was just 8 words, but those 8 words sobered me up faster than any cold shower ever could. On the side of the slide, in rough marker, someone had written, "Where have you gone, Daddy? I miss you." I just sat there, staring for what felt like an eternity, and as the tears came, the alcohol came up as well. My tears fell nakedly into the pile of sick that sat between my legs, and as the rage bubbled up in me, it felt like they were almost burned away. Someone was mocking me, mocking my son's loss, and as I staggered towards the super's office, I was madder than I had any right to be. Mr. Vidner, the super for the complex, always reminded me of one of the hobbits from The Lord of the Rings. He was short, fat, had a curly brown ring of hair around the bald spot on his crown that got bigger every year, and when he sat at his desk, it was like a child sitting in his father's chair. He nearly fell out of that chair when I slammed his office door, his expression of confused anger becoming one of confused fear as he looked on my face. He was a small man, and the sight of a large, angry drunk in his office reminded him of his stature rather quickly. "Someone has written hateful graffiti on your play park, and I want to know what you intend to do about it." He took a minute or two to collect his thoughts before asking what the hell I was talking about. I took him out to have a look, leading him to the slide in question, and he looked taken aback as he read the words. "Who would do such a thing?" he asked, more to himself than anyone. The way he side-eyed me, I could tell he thought I might have done it myself, but one look at my face made him rethink it before he said it. "I'll take care of it immediately, Mr. Dawes. In the meantime, why don't you go get some rest? You look under the weather." He had the decency not to call me a drunk out in the open, and I conceded the matter as I went home to sober up a little. As night began to fall, some undetermined amount of time later, I sat up from the couch and listened to the 5 or 6 stout cans rattle angrily to the floor. By the headache and the mealy taste in my mouth, I had not gone home and sobered up. As I moved into the kitchen to make something for dinner, I remembered the words on the slide and felt angry all over again. As the meat pie I had taken out of the freezer spun in the microwave, I wondered if Vidner had taken care of it like he said he would. I wondered if he'd painted over it or washed it away or how he had done it. Were the words still sitting there on that slide? As the microwave dinged, I resolved to go find out, and took my pie and plastic fork on a little field trip. I watched the steam roll off the top as I walked down to the little park, the night air alive with crickets and nightbirds. It would have been pretty if I hadn't been in such despair. The trees were losing their autumn leaves, becoming bare and skeletal, and the air was crisp enough to make my undershirt unadvisable. My bare feet slapped at the concrete as I walked away from my flat, and the closer I got, the better the view of the offending slide. The words were gone, the pressure washer having left the slide a little lighter for its effort, but as I came through the gate, I saw that something else had been added to the side of the structure. It looked like the same marker strokes, the handwriting big and childish, and as I read it, I felt a growl rumble in my throat. I saw you today, Daddy. I saw you, but you didn't see me. I looked around as the wind rattled the nearby tree, expecting to see a group of snickering youths as they watched me. This had teenagers written all over it, and as the pie slipped out of my hand, I loosed my shout at the sky. Why? Why did they devil me like this? Was this a game to them? When I was a kid, we would never have done something like this to anyone, let alone a grieving father. The dark offered up no answers, but the side of the play park did when I turned back. Beneath the first message, another, smaller message was written in the same childish scrawl. The longer I looked at it, the more I recognized it. How many times had I watched my son scribble words in his reader just that way, filling in the workbook pages in big, looping script as he prepared to go to kindergarten. Daddy, I can see you, but you can't see me. Please help me. It's scary here. I hunkered on my knees in the sand, looking at the words as I ran my fingers over them. They looked just like his, and as I felt a splinter catch in the pad of my thumb, I pulled it back sharply. There was no way he could be here. There was no way that he could have been hiding here for a year. But as I watched the playset, I had no doubt that he had written those words. Dale, I said, my voice quavery as I glanced into the shadowy depths of the playground. Dale, I shouted a little louder, casting around as I tried to find him. I walked around to the other side, stumbling in the gritty sand as it sucked at my feet. My head was full of rails, and my words slurred even to my own ears. There were doubtlessly people looking down through their curtains at me as I capered like a sot drunk, but I didn't care. My boy was here. He was here somewhere, and I needed to find him. I tripped then, going face down in the sand, and when I came up, I saw a new message on the wet-looking plasterwood. It was hard to see in the shadows that I sat in, but as I got closer, I put my trembling fingers on it to make sure it was real. My fingers came away tacky, the tips black as if they had touched wet marker. I need you to come get me, Daddy. I'm stuck in the sad swamps, and I need help. Excuse me, sir. Everything all right here? As their flashlights hit me, I squinted, but the words were like a brand across my eyes. The sad swamps was what Dale called the swamps of sorrow from his favorite movie, The Never-Ending Story. We had watched it about 1,000 times, and when the VHS that I had owned as a kid finally broke in the VCR, we had searched for it on DVD until we found it at a local thrift store. He watched it every day before his afternoon nap, and I imagined that he could just about quote it word for word. Seeing the words sad swamps made me certain that it was Dale talking. But how? How could he be talking to me from... The light was right in my face now, and I pulled up a hand to block it. Some of your neighbors were worried. You were faring poorly, Mr. Dawes. They heard you shouting and wanted us to come check on you. They were being kind. It seemed that everyone was being kind these days to poor old drunk Mr. Dawes. But I didn't have time for them. I'd seen something under the edge of the play park, half a word that was buried in the shadows. It was his latest message, and as I staggered towards it a little, I hoped it would tell me how to get to him. What happened? One of them asked in his jovial tone as he leaned down, Wife lock you out after you came home snookered? Well, we can get you a place to sleep it off, sir. Never. He had put a hand on my shoulder, but I pulled away from him as I tried to see the words that were written beneath the structure. It was just 6 words, but I couldn't see the last one, and the last one seemed very important. The police grabbed a hold of me, but I fought to get away as I tried to see that last word. I got as close as I could, both catching me under an arm as they pulled me away from the structure, and finally I saw it. I repeated it again and again as they put me in the back of the car, all the fight out of me now, wanting to commit it to memory before my drink-addled brain made a muck of it. We'll phone the missus and let her know that she can pick you up in the tank, Mr. Dawes. If she don't wanna, then I guess you're sobering up on a bench for the night, so long as you don't try any more of that. I ignored them as we left the parking lot, my flat disappearing behind us as I repeated those 6 words like a mantra. Look for me inside the cave. The police hadn't been wrong. My wife was livid. She came down to the station, her clothes clearly thrown on hastily, and glowered at me through the bars of the holding cell. It was just me in there with a few old gaffers, and they were snoring in a corner as I slouched on the bench. I was still imprinting those words on my brain, mumbling them like a magic spell, when I heard her voice and looked up into her scowling face. I can't believe you've done this. It isn't enough that you get sent home from work, that you do nothing but blunder around like an old tramp, and that you won't get any help for yourself. But now you go and get yourself tossed in the drunk tank. I'm done, Malcolm. Do you understand me? This is the last straw. I won't stay here and watch you destroy yourself. He's alive, I rasped out, and when she looked back at me, I saw all the anger leak out of her, only to be replaced with pity. I miss him too, just as much as you do, but you have to let him go. It's been a year, Malcolm. He's not coming home. It wasn't your fault what happened to him. You have to stop blaming yourself for this. He's been leaving me messages at the play park, Stephanie. I can prove it. Come with me and I'll show you. We can find him. We can be a family again. We can... But she cut me off with the first sob I'd heard from her in months. I'm leaving, Malcolm. When they release you in the morning, don't call me. Go back to the flat. Go to your mother's house. Go to hell for all I care. I can't watch you do this anymore. She left me there with the other drunks, but I'd already decided what I had to do. They turned me loose in the morning, and after a brisk walk home, I got the things I'd need. I brought a torch, some string, and a big hunting knife I'd had since I was a teenager, and set off for the play park. It was early morning, and I had the place to myself, save for the pigeons still gobbling at my spilled pie remains. I didn't see any new graffiti, but I didn't need any. I knew where Dale was, and as I got on my hands and knees, I crawled around the playground and into the cave. Even in my assuredness, I felt foolish as I moved into the cave. It was dark, but I could still see the light streaming in from the other side. I didn't feel that same sense of foreboding like I had before. No sense of monsters coming to gobble me up, and I turned on the torch as I checked out the corners. The cave was a box of 4 walls with a roof of thick plastic overhead, and I should have been able to see all 4 walls. 3 of the walls were normal enough, but as I looked to the west-facing wall, I was aware of another opening that led into a space that shouldn't exist. An opening between that led into deeper darkness. As my torch turned against the encroaching blackness, I turned my body in a ponderous circle and started crawling into it. If I meant to get my son back, I would need to hobble into the sad swamp and come out the other side. In contrast to the dark cave behind me, the space I entered was pitch black. The edges of my light curled oddly, the darkness seeming to retreat around the edges like felt as I moved in deeper. I wasn't underground. I was still heading forward, but given the dimensions of the play structure, the place I crawled shouldn't exist. The length was wrong. The longer I crawled, the more I expected to wake up and find that I had fallen asleep in the drunk tank. The space was cramped, but felt vast as it stretched on. It was like an abandoned underground cave, the claustrophobic passage threatening to collapse on me at any minute. Besides being black dark, it was also utterly silent. Besides the crunch of my knees as they moved over the sand, no other sounds seemed to exist. My own labored breathing seemed to be absorbed by that thick midnight around me, and every painful drag of my body sent a spasm of need through me. It was a primal need, a need to stand at my full height and stretch my arms up, a way to dissipate the confining gloom that hung around me. The same part of my brain made it pretty clear, however, how bad an idea that would be. What if my hands should pass into that darkness and never return? What if the darkness came back with the hand? I kept crawling into that inky soup, wondering if I would simply wander here forever. It was pitch outside the protective beam of my torch, and with every struggling shuffle, I wondered why I didn't turn around and go back. Nothing could survive down here. Nothing could live in this pitch blackness. If I didn't go back now, I'd never find my way out, and be forced to wander endlessly in this void until my torch went out. And then what? I knew I wasn't alone when I heard the soft scuff of feet on sand. I looked into the black expanse, expecting to see the beast that had terrified me the last time I found myself in this nothing. The beam of my torch didn't go very far. At the end of the light, I could hear the scuff of bare feet on sand, though. Something was coming towards me, and I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Would it be my son, or would it be a monster to end my journey? When a dirty, half-starved little boy buried me in a hug that circled my shoulders, I knew I'd found him. "Dale?" I whispered, but he could only nod and cry against me. I didn't waste time or breath. I just scooped him up and didn't stop moving until I was back in the lighted world of the play park. As we moved, I could feel that clawing, penetrating glare from behind me. Something had noticed I was taking its prize, and they were unhappy. I kept crawling, kept pulling, but I could hear those scrabbling feet as they kicked up sand. They were getting closer now, their growl loud and thunderous, and on a whim, I turned my torch on them. Bathed in the light, they yelped wildly and kicked up sand as they backpedaled. I didn't dare look back to see what was tailing me. I put on a burst of speed, crawling like our lives depended on it, and when I collapsed in the light of day, I was aware of people shouting at me to get out of there. Their kids were asking who I was and why I was so dirty, but they must have thought I was a bum. When they saw Dale, they tried to take him from me, but I held on like my life depended on it. And when they finally recognized us, I heard their anger turn to surprise. They took us both to the hospital, and I'm glad to say that aside from being underfed and very dirty, Dale was completely fine. My wife came to the hospital, and we both cried as she apologized for doubting me. I refused it, telling her she had nothing to apologize for. I doubted myself. I fell into the bottle and nearly lost myself in my grief. I should be apologizing to you for putting you through this for the last year. She sat with me at the hospital, both of us afraid to take our eyes off Dale as he sat placidly in his hospital bed. I asked him about what he had gone through, but he couldn't tell me much. He said that he got lost in the cave, and he crawled and crawled until he came out in the play park again. Only it wasn't his play park. The play park he found was different, and me and his friends were gone. The sky was sort of purple, and the clouds were too thick-looking to be real. I couldn't get the gate open, but that was probably good. There were these big things that would come by like living shadows, and they would look at me like I was an animal in the zoo. I drank some water from a gross puddle, but there was no food. Sometimes I went to sleep in the cave, but I always felt like something was watching me in there. It never tried to hurt me, but it always felt like I was hiding and waiting for someone to catch me. I thought I was going to starve before I heard you breathing in the cave. I had to run away to get away from some shadow people who were looking for me, and I heard you down there and went to see what the sound was. I asked him about the messages, and he said he had found some kind of marker in the sand over there, and that was about the time he started seeing a shadow inside the play park. I knew it was you. Somehow I just knew it was you, but you couldn't see me. So I started writing messages, hoping you would see them. I guess you found them. The strangest part is that Dale swears he was only there for a week. He says he kept going back into the cave, but he only slept a few times while he was away. What's more, the doctors say he doesn't appear to have grown in the time he was gone. His dental records and growth structure are the same as when he had a checkup about a month before he disappeared. I'm glad to have Dale back, but I don't let him play in the cave anymore. We still visit the play park, and I still let him slide on the slides and run on the structure like he used to, but he's forbidden to go underneath anymore. It's a rule he doesn't mind following, lest he get lost in those dark tunnels for a second time. When I was a little girl, I had a strange friend that I believed I had made up until about an hour ago. My father and mother were out of the house a lot when I was a kid. It never really occurred to me that we were poor, but looking back, I realized that we must have been. Mom worked 2 jobs, serving in a restaurant, driving a bus for the school. Dad worked in a fish market during the day, so he could attend school in the evenings. Both of them would come home every night, very late, and most of the time I was already in bed. They'd just flop down for a few hours before they had to get up and do it again. They were never cruel to us. They just didn't have time for my older brother and I. Mom and Dad got together in high school, and Mom's senior year photos show a swell of her belly as she carried my brother. They were parents before they were really more than kids themselves, and with no real skills, they had to take whatever jobs they could to keep food on the table. For the first 10 years of my life, there wasn't really a lot of happiness. There were no Christmas mornings, there weren't a lot of birthday presents, and I lacked the parental involvement that a lot of my peers seemed to have. That was probably what led me to create Mr. Gozo. My brother was supposed to be watching me after school. I've talked about my brother a little bit, but I don't think I've told you much about him, really. He was 8 years older than me, a senior in high school, who was supposed to be my caretaker while my parents were out of the house. This usually translated to him being in his room with the door closed, or him leaving the house and telling me not to answer the door or go outside. This meant that I spent a lot of time alone as a kid, but I much preferred the time when he left me alone. My brother was more than a neglectful babysitter. He could be really mean and seemed to delight in tormenting me. If he was gone, then it was just me and Mr. Gozo with the house to ourselves. Mr. Gozo was a friend that I discovered living in my house one day. He was tall, taller than my dad even, and had a strange, whispery voice that always used to make me laugh. He wore grown-up clothes, a long coat and a pair of suit pants with square-toed cowboy boots sticking out from underneath them. His head was round and pale, his eyes always seemed a little too big for his face, and he didn't have any ears, which I found very funny as a kid. His smile was my favorite thing about him, because it reminded me of the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Something else about him that always reminded me of that cat was that he would disappear whenever anyone else was around. One minute we'd be having a tea party or playing hide and seek, and the next my brother would come home and Mr. Gozo would just vanish. I told my parents about him, but they just smiled and said it was good that I had such an active imagination. My brother said I was a little freak and told me to stay out of his way. Mr. Gozo did not like my brother.
He is a brute. He knows nothing of imagination.
We played a lot, Gozo and I, but I remember his favorite game was hide and seek. He would never beat me, though. I was an excellent hider. He would clump around for a while before finally saying I'd won, and I would burst out and wrap my arms around his leg. Despite never winning, he always wanted to play. He seemed to like chasing me through the house, and when I think back on it these days, I see how lucky I was to never have learned anything to the contrary. You see, Mr. Gozo would always make these little bets before we started playing hide and seek.
If I can't find you, then I will get you whatever you desire. But if I win, then you must come back to my house to play.
Of course, I would always agree. I was 10 and very good at hiding. When I say he never found me, I mean he never found me. I would hide under things that were too hard for him to lift, or hide in places that were too small for him to get into. I would camouflage myself with blankets and pillows, and I could remain absolutely still and quiet for quite some time. Mr. Gozo would try his hardest, stomping around as his two big eyes roved everywhere. Eventually, he would just give up and tell me I had won. He always made good on his promises, too. I've watched Sailor Moon or Powerpuff Girls in the middle of the night long after Cartoon Network stopped showing cartoons, and I've eaten chocolate ice cream and pizza when we barely had groceries in the house. Much like Mr. Gozo, though, if my brother came home early, he couldn't see the food, or the show, or the new toy that Mr. Gozo had given me. I would turn back to find an empty plate or a staticky TV, and Mr. Gozo would be nowhere to be found. Mr. Gozo would play anything I wanted, but he asked to play hide and seek at least once a day. If I said I didn't want to, he never pushed the issue. He also never let losing deter him from playing. It appeared that whatever he wanted to do with me at his house could wait. He was a perfect companion for a lonely child, and I never saw his more sinister side until I looked back after the incident. Not until the hide and seek when I lost my brother. It was late, probably after 11 o'clock, and Mr. Gozo and I were playing hide and seek as we did most every day. I kept stumping him, even after hours of playing, but this looked like the time he was finally going to win. I was hiding beneath the couch cushions, compressing myself in a divot under the middle cushion where the springs were sagging. I could see him searching for me between the small gap in the cushions, and Mr. Gozo was looking desperately. He had lost 8 times in a row, and I could see that his patience was starting to deteriorate. He was pushing things aside, rustling the curtains, and pushing the pillows off the couch roughly as he searched for me. As the pillows hit the floor, I must have moved slightly, because he turned those much too expressive eyes back to the couch. They zeroed in on the cushion, and I knew that Gozo was about to win. He wrapped his long, sinuous fingers around the cushion, grinning as he prepared to lift it up. I tried to stifle a laugh as I prepared to be found. Just then, keys rattled in the door, and I saw Mr. Gozo turn his head to look. I looked too, and when I turned back, he was gone. My brother walked into the living room, and as I climbed out from under the couch, I could smell him before I saw him. He'd come home like this a few times, smelling sour and like the chemicals Mom kept under the sink, and he sighed in disgust as he looked at the house. I hadn't expected him to be back so soon, and Mr. Gozo had been a little rough in his searching the last few times. There were pillows and blankets on the ground, the curtains were open, and there were books scattered around, as well as magazines on the floor. The living room was a mess, and as I climbed from the couch, he asked me what the hell I had done. Nothing, I said timidly. Mr. Gozo and I were just playing hide and seek. My brother rolled his eyes. Mr. Gozo, Mr. Gozo, Mr. Gozo. He slurred the name as he said it, stumbling a little as he flopped onto the couch. I am so sick of hearing about that stupid freak. Clean up this crap before Mom and Dad get home, and yell at me for it. I started picking up, feeling him watching me as I moved around. He was acting weird, weirder than usual, and he was making me uncomfortable as he sat staring on the couch. I cleaned up the books, the magazines, put the blankets back on the quilt rack, and closed the curtains. As I went to put the pillows on the couch, I looked into his eyes and saw something I hadn't seen there before. It wasn't love. I knew what that looked like, but it was different from anything else I'd ever seen. I didn't like it, and when he caught my wrist and pulled me towards him, I squirmed and tried to get away. Let go, you're hurting me, I said, trying to keep the whine out of my voice. If I whined, it would only egg him on. Don't be such a... He burped, and I could smell the pungent brew. Such a party pooper. Come on and sit with your big brother. I struggled, pulling against him as he tried to pull me onto his lap. He was acting really weird, and my brain screamed at me that I did not want him to get his hands on me. I looked around, looking for Mr. Gozo for help, and saw him peeking from the hallway. His expressive face told me that he wanted to help, but he didn't know how. There seemed to be a sort of duality about him, a want to help his friends, but a knowledge that such a thing would be unwise. My brother swore at me, yanking on my arm and telling me to stop being such a cold bitch. Just like that bitch at the party, he mumbled, yanking hard and almost pulling me off my feet. Suddenly, though, I knew how I could get him to stop. There was a way that Gozo could help me. I can't play right now, big brother. I'm playing with Mr. Gozo. He'll get mad if we don't finish the game. I saw him sneer, but I also saw something else there. My brother pretended he wasn't a little weirded out by Mr. Gozo, but I could tell that the idea of an invisible friend kind of freaked him out. He had seen the pictures I drew of him, and I couldn't help but notice the shudder they elicited in him sometimes. When he was wobbly, like he was tonight, he was especially nervous about Mr. Gozo, and I decided to take advantage of that to get away. "You played with him long enough," he said, his grip tightening. Why don't you come play in my room? I've got some new games I want to show you." I shook my head. "Mr. Gozo will get mad. I have to finish my game." I turned back to the hallway and saw him shaking his head, begging me not to go on, but I pressed my luck. "But, if you play with us and finish the game, then I'd be done and we could, play, I guess." I tried to stay calm, but his touch was making me nervous, his sweaty hands making my skin crawl. My brother looked thoughtful for a moment and let my arm slip out of his hand. "Okay, one more game with Mr. Gozo, and then it's our turn to play, right?" His smile made me want to run out into the night and never come back. "Right. You hide and I'll hide while Mr. Gozo counts. Go hide so he doesn't find you." My brother got up, wobbling a little, and went down the hall. I turned to go hide too, and that's when I heard Mr. Gozo's voice. Please don't do this. You could just come with me. He can't hurt you where we're going." I turned around and saw Mr. Gozo towering over me, his eyes looking sorrowful as his mouth held in a frown. "Count to 100, Mr. Gozo. If you find me first, I'll go with you, but if you find him first, he has to go with you." We looked at each other for a count of 10 before he put his hands over his eyes, and I ran off to hide. I went in the kitchen, having a perfect place in mind, as I heard Mr. Gozo's count reach 15. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink and squeezed in, not sure if I would still fit. I had found this spot a while ago, seeing the small space beside it once you were under the sink, and marked it for future use. I knew it would be too small for Mr. Gozo, or my brother, to squeeze into, and they would have a hard time seeing me in the little space between the drawers and the wall. I squeezed in there, pulling the drawers back in as I inadvertently nudged them, and pressed myself as flat as I could against the wall. Even if my brother got bored and came to find me, he'd never find me here. I breathed very shallowly and stifled my gasp as I heard Gozo's count reach 100. Then, the game began. It started out normally, Gozo seeking and me hiding. He checked beneath things, he checked under things, but the gravity of the game began to shift very quickly. Gone was the playful talk as he tried to find me. Gone was the playful way he looked. Now he was shoving things over, pushing them around, and it sounded like he was tearing the house apart. He moved into the kitchen, glasses breaking and things on the counter being pushed onto the floor. This wasn't like him. Why was he acting like this? I shivered in my hiding place, waiting to be found or for him to move on. I heard the table flip over, the face of the microwave shatter as it hit the ground, and the floor groan as the refrigerator was pushed over, its guts spilling everywhere. Mr. Gozo called my name, his normally happy voice cracking with sorrow and anger. I wanted to go to him then, wanted to wrap my arms around him and comfort my old friend, but I didn't dare leave my cubby. I would stay hidden all night if I needed to. A part of me now feared Gozo as much as I feared my brother. "Come out! Come out! It's not too late. You can still..." What in the hell is going on in here? I heard my brother yelling, could almost picture him in the doorway to the kitchen, and I eased out of the cubby and moved a shaky hand towards the door of the cabinet. I heard Gozo's heavy boots as he stepped towards him, my brother asking who he was and what the hell he was doing in our house. He was slurring and shouting. Mr. Gozo was silent as the grave as he walked towards him. I pushed the corner of the cabinet open, just a little bit, and looked out of the crack, seeing the two long legs as they walked towards my suddenly scared brother. I was looking between his ankles as he walked. He had been so close to my hiding place that he might have heard the silverware shivering in the drawers if I had started shaking any harder.
My name is Mr. Gozo, and I believe that you have been found.
My brother screamed as Mr. Gozo blocked him from sight, and I pulled myself back into the cubby and sat shuddering as he went right on yelling in terror. I stayed there until my parents came home an hour later and called the police. They had many questions, the police and my parents. I told them that I'd been playing with Mr. Gozo when my brother had come home. He was acting weird, so I said he should play hide and seek with us, so I could hide from him. He was trying to get me to do things that made me feel weird, so I hid, and then Mr. Gozo had wrecked the house looking for him. When my brother came to see what all the noise was about, Mr. Gozo had taken him away, and I had hidden in my spot while he screamed. The police officer didn't understand what I was talking about with all the Mr. Gozo stuff, but when he asked my parents if they had a son, they just shook their head. No, she's always been an only child. I could have sworn we called a sitter for her since we knew we wouldn't be home till late. Didn't you hire a sitter? Dad asked Mom. Mom just shook her head. I thought you had. They both, however, had this dreamy look on their face, confusion mixed with embarrassment, like when you walk into a room and forget why you came there. It probably seems weird to you that I keep calling my brother by his title and not his name. It's because, as I saw my parents looking so confused, I realized that I didn't know his name either. I remembered that I'd had a brother, in that vague way that you remembered that when you were 6 you had a pet, but not exactly what happened to it. But I couldn't remember his name. He was gone from all the family photos. His name was gone from any journal entry or class assignment I had wrote on it, and no one remembered him at all. It was as though he never existed, and even now, I can't remember what he looks like or what his voice sounded like. I only remember that he existed, and he's gone. I wonder often if that's what happened when Mr. Gozo caught you. The police had a lot of questions after that, and it was finally agreed upon that I had been the victim of a break-in and hidden from the intruders. They hadn't found me, so they had left after a while, and I was extremely lucky, they said. The police agreed to check the house, but found nothing. My parents said they would check their valuables, but never reported anything missing. Mr. Gozo had only taken one thing, and they couldn't remember that it had even existed to start with. They sent me to bed, telling me to get some sleep while they cleaned up the mess, and that's when I saw Mr. Gozo for the last time. I was lying in bed that night, listening to my parents talk about how they needed to be more careful about leaving someone here with me, when I suddenly felt his eyes on me. I rolled over to see his sad face, his heavy eyes full of sorrow, and his too big mouth turned down into a frown. I also saw the speckles of blood on his normally so clean coat, and the small, hesitant smile lying just below the surface as he gauged my reaction to him. Go away, Mr. Gozo. I don't want to play with you anymore.
I made him go away. I made him stop hurting you. I showed you what I was so you could be safe, and now you want me gone?
I rolled over, looking at him and yelling, "Go away, Gozo!"
Say it again. Say it thrice, and I'll never darken your door again.
Go away, Gozo, I almost whispered, hearing my parents stop talking downstairs. He evaporated like a fine mist, and I never saw him again. Well, until today. I'm a grown-up now, married with a girl of my own, and I haven't thought about Mr. Gozo until just a few hours ago. I was putting away laundry when I found my 4-year-old hiding in the towel closet. Emily apparently got her father's hiding genes, because a blind man could have found her hiding under that pile of towels. She squealed as I found her, but then looked grumpy and told me to close the door before he found her.
"Who?" I asked, smiling at her as I lifted her into my arms. "Mr. Gozo," Emily said, and my blood ran cold. She took me to her room when I asked who that was and showed me pictures. He wears the same long coat, the same straight black pants. She even drew the square-toed boots that stick out from beneath them. She captured his face in a way that I never could have as a child. His pale oval face, his almost cartoonishly large eyes, his smiling mouth of pointed teeth, and his distinct lack of ears. His head is still shaved, but she's drawn him with a large top hat, an eye floating in its middle. The eye is blue. Were my brother's eyes maybe blue? She's in my room now, with me, whining because she can't finish her game with Mr. Gozo. Sometimes I feel like I can see him out of the corner of my eye as I write this, his wide smile predatory. I don't know what to do. I can see Emily talking to him in the mirror, his two large forms sitting on the bed as he listens to her. Every now and again, though, I see those two big eyes of his glance over at me, knowing me and seeing me for who I am. I want to take my daughter and run, but I don't know how he will react to such a move. Perhaps I can offer him one last game. Perhaps I can finally give him what he always wanted. Perhaps I can save my daughter, as my big brother inadvertently saved me all those years ago. I have to try, don't I?
I hadn't thought about it until last week, but it seems to have snowballed into something that's gotten out of control. I was looking through some photos while helping my mom move when I saw him for the first time in 15 years. Dad had passed away a few months ago, and Mom was just starting to clean out some of his things. The picture had been taken at a birthday party, my 9th birthday party, to be exact, and it showed my friends and I standing in front of the house and smiling as my mom took the picture. There were about 9 of us, all wearing party hats and ice cream mustaches under our noses, but the happy faces of my friends and I weren't what had caught my eye. It was the gaunt man standing in the window of the living room, the one looking out at us with the empty black eyes and the sinister little smile, the man who had haunted my childhood, though I'd never quite believed in him after the age of 12, Mr. Danvers, a specter that my late father had brought to life. I remember the first time I had ever even heard of Mr. Danvers, and the memory made my skin crawl. It wasn't scary because of what I had been told, but because of the unwilling way that my father had shared it. I had been 5, and we were getting ready to go to preschool. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I was cranky as I sat at the table and picked at my breakfast. I was wearing half my school clothes, 1 sock, 1 shoe, and I was so far from being ready that when my dad saw me, you could tell that he knew we were going to be late. "Come on, kiddo, we need to get moving. Finish your breakfast, get your clothes on, find your shoes, let's get on the road." I don't remember what I said to him, something snarky and grumpy, and when he turned back to me, he spoke before he had quite made up his mind to. "You better hurry and get ready before Mr. Danvers comes to get you." The silence that hung after that statement was enough to make me turn my head and look at him, and that's why I saw when he slowly put a hand over his mouth. He was looking at me like he'd just sworn, and he was afraid that I would start repeating it. He seemed terrified of what might suddenly come out of my mouth. "Who's Mr. Danvers?" I asked, and that seemed to seal the deal. Dad went rigid, not all at once, but slowly, like something petrifying. His eyes stared out at nothing, his mouth opening a little bit as he gasped slightly. His body seemed to be trying to fight whatever was going on and failing, his mind railing against the inevitable. He looked like a landed fish, something struggling to breathe, even as it struggles with the hook that has pulled it from the water of life. And when I asked the question a second time, the hook seemed to find its anchor, and he stopped fighting. He comes for bad kids, naughty kids, kids who don't listen. He finds where they hide, and they go missing. When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better be scared. He's tall and old, with skin so thin. His hair is wisps, gray as tin. His teeth are sharp, his eyes are black. He'll drag you off, and you'll never come back. When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better be scared. He delivered it all in the well-trained cadence of an off-Broadway actor at an audition. It sounded like something he had repeated 1,000 times, and I realized then that it was something I'd never forget. The scariest part about it wasn't what he had said. It was how he had said it. The voice was so different from Dad's that it was like watching a ventriloquist talk through him. Suddenly, it felt like a stranger was in the house, and I shuddered as a cold chill ran through me. I didn't say anything in the face of that silence, but when I lifted a hand to my eyes, I realized I was crying. Large, silent tears were sliding down my face, and as my dad came out of his trance, he started crying too. He came to scoop me into his arms and pressed me to his chest as he repeated the same thing again and again and again into my corn silk hair. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm so sorry. When Mom came home to find us both watching Disney movies on the couch, she asked why he had called out of work and not taken me to school. When he explained the situation in soft tones as he pressed his mouth against her ear, she joined us on the couch and pulled me into her lap. That was the first night I saw the old specter, but it wouldn't be the last. I woke up with the most profound chill I'd ever felt. It ran up my cheeks like mice feet, and my eyes popped open as I lay in bed. The room was dark, my toys casting shadows across the floor as the moon crept in through the window. But I knew those spooky shapes were not the source of my discomfort. I could almost imagine that I heard the song Dad had sung as it scampered in with the air conditioner in the vents. I could see the dust motes in the moonbeams as they boogied to that haunted chorus, and as I stared at them, that's when I saw him. He was hunkered in the corner, his knees against his chest, his arms resting on his knees. He was looking at me from the pit of shadows where he sat, and when he realized I was looking back at him, I saw a wide grin stretch across his face. His toothy mouth stretched ear to ear, and as he stood up, I could hear his joints popping like kindling wood. His hair set neatly on his head, looking like the hair you saw on zombies in horror movies, and it brushed the ceiling as he stood up. He rose until his head nestled in the corner of that ceiling, his frame all of 8 feet tall. He had a hat in his hand, a hat I would later learn was called a bowler, and his arms were covered in a rich brown suit coat. He was wearing a suit beneath it, but I was only vaguely aware of it. As he rose, the moon casting his features in contrast, I was mesmerized by his eyes. They were dark pits of shadow that looked at me with mirthful knowledge. "Sorry to wake you," he said, his voice sounding like someone who's lost their breath to excitement. "I just wanted a peek. I'm sure I'll get a closer look sometime. Toodaloo." I started screaming then, and when Dad came in and turned the light on, there was nothing in the corner but the star stickers that stuck to the ceiling above the spot. Those stickers never glowed again, and I took them down when I noticed and threw them away. I was afraid he had gotten his taint on them. Dad pulled me into a hug, Mom beside him, hugging me in an instant, and both of them held me until the shaking stopped. After that, I saw him any time I did something disobedient. Sometimes I would see him lurking in the corners of my vision if I said something smart to my mom or dad. Sometimes I would feel those black eyes watching me if I didn't do my chores. There was a time when I heard him laughing after I'd gotten angry at my mom, and I was always quick to apologize and make things right. Mr. Danvers made me conscious of my actions in a way that I'd never been before, and I was a better person because of it, I suppose. I never saw him when I was rude to my friends, but just the knowledge that he might be watching me made me forgive more often, and I was less likely to be cruel to others. Sometimes when I thought about cheating on a test or taking something from a store, I would imagine him just waiting to get me and think better of it. It all culminated when I was 12, on the day I ran away from home. I'd been looking forward to a sleepover at my friend's house that weekend, an event that was highly anticipated. Matt had one of these for his birthday every year, and a bunch of us would go to his house and eat junk food and watch movies and tell scary stories and just have the times of our lives. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, and I knew that if Mom found the math test at the bottom of my bag, the one with the big red F on it, I could hang it up. I'd buried it deep in my backpack, but not deep enough, apparently. She had found it before I could make my escape to the party, and we had gotten into a screaming match over it. It was unfair, I told her. I'd looked forward to this party for so long, and it wasn't fair that now I didn't get to go. She said that was too bad, and if parties were more important than schoolwork, then I needed to get my priorities in order. I was so mad, so furious with my mom, that I did the unthinkable before I could remember the specter of Mr. Danvers. I told her I was going whether she gave me permission or not, and walked out the door before she could stop me. I ran up the street, heading for Matt's house, listening to my mom call from behind me. I expected her to be angry. I expected her to be upset. Instead, she just sounded scared. She told me to come back, that we could talk about this, but I was in no mood to listen. I was going to the party, whether she liked it or not, and nothing was going to stop me from getting there. It wasn't until I saw him standing under a burnt-out streetlight that I remembered the looming specter of Mr. Danvers. When it began to flicker, I realized it had a little more juice in it. In the flickering light, I could see the tall, thin frame as he grinned at me, his translucent skin clinging to his face like a mask. He had his hat in his hand again, his immaculate suit still looking pristine in the flickering light, and his eyes reflected that flicker like a stuffed animal's. He looked unreal, standing in the everyday world, like a piece of Halloween decor that's a little too well made. He was utterly still, his head brushing the bottom of the lamp, but his fingers gave away his excitement. They drummed on the brim of his hat and made him look like a dog preparing to yank his lead and give chase. We stood looking at each other for a count of 5 before I turned and shot off towards home. Mr. Danvers was coming after me just as quick, but his lack of footfalls made me panic all the more. I turned to look and saw the too-tall thing eating up the ground. His long legs moved like a spider's, and he ran like a cartoon character in big, exaggerated galumphs. He was gaining on me with every step, his strides twice my own, and I screamed in frustration and terror as I put on an extra burst of speed. To think that a moment of frustration was going to seal my fate forever. I'd been hyperfixated on my behavior for so long, and now a sudden lapse in judgment was going to kill me. "When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better beware." The wind seemed to bring the hateful words to my mind as it rushed past my ears. "When Mr. Danvers comes to town, you better be scared." I was scared. I was terrified. When my house came into view, I was afraid that I would get snatched within view of the front door. Mr. Danvers would reach out with one long arm and pull me into the darkness, and I'd be gone forever. It would happen just that quick, and no one would know what had gotten me. Correction, my parents would know. They would know, but how would they tell anyone? To admit to such would make them sound nuts and probably make people think that they were responsible for my disappearance. I turned suddenly, going through the gate and running up the walk, and I felt the icy chill of Mr. Danvers' hand as it passed inches from me. I took the steps 2 at a time, praying the door would be unlocked, and when Mom threw it open, I leapt into her arms. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please don't let him take me." I pressed my face against her, not daring to look back into the yard. Mom whispered that she forgave me, but when she talked to Mr. Danvers, her voice was a mixture of rage and an old fear. "Get out of here. All's forgiven. There's no misdeed. You cannot take him." I kept my face pressed against my mom, but I still heard Mr. Danvers' spidery voice when he answered her. "Another time, then." When I peeked back, he was gone. Dad came home an hour later, getting off work early after Mom called him, but I was still shaking and sobbing on the couch. "Why?" I asked him when he came in. "Why did you tell me about Mr. Danvers?" My dad was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer, before sighing and saying, "'Cause it's not something I meant to do. It happens. Someday it'll happen to you too as well." "Never. I would never do that to my child." I shuddered as he wrapped me in a hug, but I didn't pull away. "Sweetie, you won't have a choice." I didn't have a choice. My father didn't have a choice. No one has a choice. Once you know about him, the knowledge demands to be shared. His name is dark knowledge, a secret shared by many, and it must be served. That was when he told me how he had come to know about Mr. Danvers from his father. I was playing with something on the couch when Dad told me to clean my room. I ignored him, wanting to finish my game, and when he said if I didn't go do it now, he would call Mr. Danvers, I looked up, and when he said it, the look on his face was both confused and afraid. Dad, your grandpa, wasn't always the nice guy that you know. He joined AA when I was in high school, but before that he was a drunk. He could be mean when he was drunk, too, and I should have known better than to hesitate when he asked me to do something. Instead, I asked who Mr. Danvers was, and when he sang me the little song, it was the soberest I'd ever seen him up until that point. The words were forced out of him like vomit, and when he finished, he threw his arms around me and told me how sorry he was. Dad looked at me, and his eyes were hollow pits. I saw him in my room that night, and it wasn't the last time either. He told me that when he'd told the story to Mom, the one about his father telling him about Mr. Danvers, she'd cried and said that she'd seen him too. Her dad told her too, "One day you'll tell your kids. You won't want to, but you won't have a choice. The song is as inevitable as Mr. Danvers." "What you got there?" I jumped as Mom came in and found me looking at the picture. I put it in my pocket, not wanting to remind her about Mr. Danvers if I could help it. I moved to another box, Mom taking the box of photos I'd been looking through, and I tried to put the name out of my mind. It was easy to do as I worked, but as I sat at home later, still sore from a day of moving furniture and sorting boxes, I started thinking about it. If my parents and I knew about Mr. Danvers, did anyone else? I pulled up Reddit and made the post before I could think better of it. I didn't know if you could transfer the knowledge like that, but I wanted to know bad enough to find out. "Hey guys, I remembered something from when I was a kid. I just wanted to know if anyone else had heard of it." My dad told me a spooky story about Mr. Danvers when I was a kid, saying he would come get me. My mom knew about it too, but I was wondering if it was something anyone else had heard of, or if it was something that he made up. The post had barely sat for 5 minutes before I got a response. It wasn't the last either. Yeah, my dad told me about him too when I was little. Seems like I must have had nightmares about it, 'cause I can remember dreaming he was in the corner of my room sometimes. OMG, so weird. That was exactly what my mom called it too. It was weird when she told me too. I thought she was having a seizure. My uncle used to tell me that he would come get me if I was bad. Wasn't there a song or a poem that went along with it too? Yeah, it was pretty catchy, but I can't remember all the words. On and on and on. The thread had about 100 comments, and not all of them were Americans either. Mr. Danvers seemed to be something that lived in the consciousness of most English-speaking people, and even if it had a different name, the descriptions they gave were exactly the same. Tall, suited, pale, wispy hair, sharp teeth, black eyes. The description was universal, and the idea that I wasn't alone didn't make me feel any better. If you too have experienced Mr. Danvers, then it's already too late. One day you'll tell your kids. One day they will have the knowledge. One day, if they're lucky enough to avoid the icy grip of Mr. Danvers, they'll pass it on. The cycle always continues, whether you want it to or not. One day, I too will infect my child with the looming specter of Mr. Danvers. I've been searching for this tape most of my life. I've thought about nothing else since it was taken from me 12 years ago. As I sit in my grandmother's bedroom, holding the familiar red plastic in my hands, I feel a sense of inner peace. I know that my search is over, and that serenity can follow. Mr. Harzows Corner was a show that I watched religiously from the age of 4 to 6. It wasn't some mysterious TV show that I saw on basic cable. It wasn't some scrambled signal I got from a weird public access network. It was actually something I found at a church rummage sale. The box of VHS tapes was sitting on a little table with the words 5 for $1 scrolled across it in permanent marker. I had leafed through it and seen the usual church swap meet stuff. Winnie the Pooh, Veggie Tales, all the Disney movies with their cracked plastic windows and dirty fingerprints on the names. But nothing really stood out. I had selected a few Winnie the Pooh episodes when I found the dirty plastic cassette near the bottom. It had a lurid red body, the color similar to old lipstick, and a handwritten name on the front. The black magic marker name read Mr. Harzows Corner, and it immediately caught my attention for some reason. I picked it up and just looked at it for a moment. I had grown up in an age of strange cassette tapes. Nickelodeon put out the chunky orange cassette tapes that often had episodes of Rugrats or Wild Thornberrys. And even some of the VeggieTales cassettes were different colors, depending on whether they were holiday specials or not. This one, however, seemed odd right off the bat. The plastic just felt thick in my fingers, and I remember both wanting to put it down and never put it down again. Finally, after 10 minutes of just looking at it, I did put it down, and I grabbed 2 cassettes featuring episodes of Barbie's Dream House, a Nickelodeon cassette featuring the Rugrats, and 2 with handwritten names saying they were old Winnie the Pooh cartoon episodes. I brought them to my mom, and after looking over them, she nodded and gave me $1. I had taken them to Miss Wazowski, the cheery old lady who often organizes these rummage sales, and she put them in a plastic grocery bag and smiled at me as I walked to rejoin my mom. It wasn't until I got home that I realized there was a 6th tape in that bag, though. I had just turned on the VCR TV combo in my room when I realized there was an unfamiliar, yet very familiar red cassette tape at the bottom of the bag that had definitely not been there when I'd checked out. I picked it up and saw that Mr. Harzows Corner was scrawled across the front, and it was weird that I didn't remember picking it up at all. Instead of putting it back, I put it in the VCR and watched as the static began to clear on the screen. I had been intending to watch some of the Winnie the Pooh episodes, but the bag of tapes would sit forgotten for quite some time. Mr. Harzows Corner would be the only thing I really cared about for the foreseeable future. The show appeared to be nothing special. It was clearly a Mr. Rogers knockoff, but the Mr. Harzow character was strange, yet endearing. He looked normal enough, a slight blonde guy, taller than your average kids show host, with a corduroy jacket and a pair of battered jeans that covered the tops of his Reebok sneakers. The camera showed him coming into a normal living room, again very reminiscent of Mr. Rogers, and then greeting everyone with a big smile and a waving hand. "Good afternoon, boys and girls. And of course, a very special afternoon to children of all ages. Welcome to Mr. Harzow's Corner. Know that I am glad to see you, and that I am always here, just for you." As it went on, Mr. Harzow's Corner turned out to be nothing like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Mr. Rogers often taught children life lessons about accepting people and being a friend, and lessons about how the world worked. Mr. Harzow's Corner was more like having your own personal therapist inside your TV. Mr. Harzow taught no life lessons. He went on no adventures in make-believe. He just sat in his big easy chair with a cup of tea at his elbow and listened. First time I watched the episode, I was a little bit confused. After his greeting, he just leaned back and looked at me, smiling in a very strange way. His smile was warm, inviting even, but he seemed to be waiting for someone on the other end of the camera to begin talking. He just sat there staring at me, and I began to become a little creeped out. Even at 4, I knew it was a little bit unusual for adults to just sit there and stare at you. I remember reaching out to hit stop on the tape when suddenly Mr. Harzow cocked his head and seemed to speak directly to me. "Leaving so soon? I understand. Well, I'm glad you came to see me today. I hope you'll come again very soon." My fingers stopped over the button. Was he talking to me? It seemed like he had been, but this was just a VHS tape. This was an age before interactive tapes, and the idea that the VHS could talk to you was a little eerie, but also a little bit interesting. When he had spoken directly to me, I had remembered feeling a little sad that I was leaving already. He seemed like he understood, but maybe he was a little sad to see me go as well. I recalled my hand, and that big grin spread across his face again. "Changed your mind? I'm so glad. So why don't you tell me about your day? I'm sure I'd love to hear all about it." I sat for a moment, thinking about what to do. Finally, I told the smiling stranger on the tape about my day. I told him about my mother, and going to the rummage sale, about finding his cassette tape, about bringing all the cassette tapes home, and discovering that his cassette tape was in with the ones I'd bought. I told him I hoped I wouldn't get in trouble for having 6 instead of 5 cassette tapes, because my mother would think I had stolen it and she would get mad. Through it all, Mr. Harzow just sat and nodded, smiling his smile and listening as if I had the most interesting things in the world to talk about. Even at 4, though, I began to think that this was just someone pretending to listen. I remember thinking back to shows like Dora the Explorer, where Dora would ask a question and then pretend to listen to your answer. No matter what you told her to do, whether it was to go towards the next thing she had to do or sit in the grass and look at the clouds, she always came up with the right answer and went off to do what she was supposed to. I assumed that Mr. Harzow would do the same. He would interrupt me any minute now, just like Dora did if you spoke for too long, and start on some pre-scripted bit of dialogue. But he didn't. He sat and listened politely until I was done speaking. Then he nodded and answered me as if we were two people having a normal conversation. "It sounds as though it's been an exciting day for you. I'm glad you got to go and do something important, something that you enjoy. It's a real honor to be part of your life, and I hope we can be friends for many years to come." I spent the rest of the day in my room, talking with Mr. Harzow and telling him about my family, my home, and my life. He always seemed interested in my stories, and he always listened with that big smile and that fatherly way of talking about everything. My mom called me for dinner, and he said he would wait for me to come back. When I returned, he was still sitting and looking at the screen like I had never left. He asked me about dinner, and we talked until it was time for me to go to bed. "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked, and I assured him that he would. I nearly left the TV on and just went to bed, but something told me that might be a bad idea. Not because the tape was cursed or haunted, but because Mom might come in and find it on. She might talk to Mr. Harzow, and Mr. Harzow might decide to be her friend instead of mine. The thought of losing Mr. Harzow, even after such a short time, made me feel furious, and I turned off the tape and went grudgingly to bed. I spent the next 5 months with my nose pressed against the TV screen, and Mr. Harzow listening to all my problems and woes. When my mom grounded me after the dog knocked the lamp over, he listened and consoled me. When my dad accidentally bumped me and I fell down the last 3 stairs, he was the one who told me it would all be okay. Every childhood problem, every unforeseen event, Mr. Harzow was there for me. It wasn't just that he listened. It wasn't even his advice that made me love him so. When Mr. Harzow talked to you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. His attention was the most important thing you could ever have, and my 4-year-old brain drank that attention in. I became hesitant to leave the house, making up excuses why Mom couldn't go places, since I'd have to come with her. I wanted to spend every waking moment with my new friend, but something on the horizon would leave me with even less time with my dear Mr. Harzow. When I had to start kindergarten, Mr. Harzow told me how it would be new and exciting, and how he wanted to hear all about it when I got home. I attended kindergarten for about a week, coming straight home to lay on the floor of my room and talk with my new friend. When Mom got a new job. She had landed a job as a tech support supervisor for a new company, which meant she couldn't take me after school anymore. Dad worked in a prison, so he was almost always at work. It began to look like I might have to go into after-school care. I was understandably upset about this, because it would limit the already slim time I had to chat with Mr. Harzow. Fortunately, there was an alternative. My grandmother agreed to take me after school. My grandmother lived alone, my grandfather having died before I was born, and I think she was excited about watching me. Grandma had been very sad since my grandfather's passing, and it had turned her into a quiet shell of her former self. My mom always talked about what an outspoken and vivacious woman my grandmother had been when she was younger, and now it seemed like I might get to meet this new grandma. As bad as it sounds, I wasn't really all that interested in any of it though. I simply wanted a place with a VHS player so I could watch my tape. At first, that was all we did too. Grandma would pick me up from school, asking how my day had been, and asking what I might like to do once we got home, and I would tell her that I wanted to watch my tapes in the den. She would offer to bake cookies with me or maybe take me to the park, but I was fully invested in the silky voice of Mr. Harzow. I would come in and lay my book bag down and go sit in the den for hours as I talked quietly to my good friend about everything and anything. He smiled when I told him about my grandma and said it was nice that I was keeping her company. Grandmothers are such a valuable resource of knowledge, and the fact that you have such a good relationship with yours is truly special. I agreed, but I was still very guarded about the tape. I would often turn it off when Grandma brought me snacks or asked if I was interested in going outside. I didn't want her to see Mr. Harzow, and I think I was still afraid that she would take him away from me if she saw him. She would want him to be her friend, and then I would be unable to see him since he would want to spend all his time with her. Mr. Harzow never said as much. All of his advice was placidly given through the TV after he had sat and listened to me. But I knew that if I coveted this tape, then others might as well. Over time, Grandma did manage to coax me out of the den. I was 5 after all, and the smell of cookies or the promise of ice cream had a talismanic effect on me still. Mr. Harzow became an after-dinner friend, a rainy day friend, but I still found myself wanting to spend as much time with him as I could. No matter what I was doing, playing on the swings or sitting in class or making cookies with Grandma, or even sleeping in my bed, it seemed that I was thinking about Mr. Harzow. I would find myself hungry for any time I could get with him, and there were nights that I quietly whispered to him from the floor of my room as my parents slept not too far away. It didn't come to a head until I got careless at Grandma's house one day. It had been the best day my 6-year-old brain could remember. Grandma had taken me to the local carnival, more of a street fair than a regular fair, and I had done it all. I had ridden ponies, I had eaten so much I thought I would bust, I had seen clowns and jugglers and listened to bands, and for a moment I'd even stopped feeling the tug of Mr. Harzow. We came home and I ate dinner, and Grandma asked me if I wanted some TV time before my mom came to pick me up. I said I did, and I rushed off to tell Mr. Harzow about all the exciting things I had done and seen, and he laughed and told me how much fun it all sounded like. As he spoke, I remember yawning as his pleasant voice drifted over me, and when I felt my face drifting towards the carpet, I don't even think I was aware I was going to sleep. When I woke up in my bed the next morning, I was confused. When I couldn't find my videotape in my bag before school, I was frantic. I thought about it the whole way to school and decided that I must have left it at Grandma's house. I had fallen asleep in front of the little TV in the guest room, and so the tape must still be there. I figured it wouldn't be a problem. Grandma was going to come pick me up after school, so I could get it while I was there. When my mom picked me up instead, I was a little bit confused. "Sorry, sweetie, but Grandma's sick, so she can't take you today." Mom had taken off work for the afternoon to pick me up, and I spent the afternoon walking around the house like a junkie. I hadn't been without my tape for the last few years, so being without it now was like torture. I tried to go out and play, but I just couldn't get interested in any of the games. I tried to watch TV, but none of my favorite shows seemed to hold my attention. I just walked around aimlessly, wanting to talk to Mr. Harzow. I'd had a pretty good day that day. He would want to hear about it. He would want to hear about how my team had won at dodgeball, about how my sculpture had been praised by the teacher in art class, about how I'd made a new friend. Not being able to tell him was torture, but I knew I had to stay strong. Grandma would be better tomorrow. I just knew it. It turned out Grandma was sick that whole week, though. By the end of that week, I was becoming a mess. My parents just saw it as me being a hyperactive kid, but I felt like I was actually going through withdrawals. Sometimes I would just lie on the floor, knees tucked to my chest, and hyperventilate. I remember vividly the feeling of my breath as it rushed out and rasped wetly against my skin. I remember feeling like I might vomit, but being unable to bring up anything. I remember my dad finally taking me and putting me in my room one Saturday, because I had done nothing for 3 hours but stare at the ceiling and shudder. This will sound dramatic to you as you sit in your nice warm house. You'll think I was just overreacting or being a spoiled child who couldn't get their way. Some of you, though, the ones who have loved something self-destructive and lived through it, might understand what it was like. After a week, I asked my mom if maybe we could go visit Grandma. I told my mom I was worried about her and wanted to see her. We were driving back from school, Grandma having been sick all week, and the idea suddenly occurred to me that maybe we could go check on her. Anything at this point to get my fix. Mom had knocked about 20 times when she finally used the spare key to open the lock and head inside. I was in as soon as the gap in the door was big enough. The house looked different, but I hardly noticed. I was charging down the hall to the guest room, Mom calling for my grandmother as she came inside behind me. The door to the little guest room was ajar, and I crashed through it and knelt before the silent altar of that cold little TV on the floor. I pushed the button, but nothing happened. I pushed it again, but still nothing happened. I peeked into the VCR slot and found it empty. Someone had taken my tape. I came hobbling from the room on all fours, probably possessed of that "give us the precious" look old Smeagol showed to Frodo far too often. I heard Mom in the kitchen, still looking for my grandma, but I only had one thing on my mind. Mr. Harzow had to be here somewhere. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, cocking my head like a dog as I listened. I could hear him. I could hear Mr. Harzow. I could hear the melodic sound of his voice. I could hear the soothing tones that had so often told me that everything would be fine. I had craved that voice for the past 7 days, and now it was so close I could almost taste it. I ambled up the stairs as quiet as I could, pressing my ear to the door of my grandma's room. I could hear him telling her how he understood her woes and commiserated with her sorrow. I shoved the door open, looking into the squalor that had become my grandmother's room. It was filthy. A smell like waste just left to drop where it would assaulted my nose, along with the smell of spoiled food. Grandma was perched on the bed like a gargoyle, her eyes glued to the little TV on the nightstand. The glow from it illuminated her face like a death mask. It had only been a week, but she looked so haggard and so old that it almost scared me to look at her. She jumped when I screamed at her to give me back my tape. She covered the TV, the screen making her eyes shine with lust as the two of us yelled at each other like angry cats. I told her how unfair it was that she could just take things from me, and demanded that she give it back. She said it was her tape now, and that she would never give it back. In the background, I could also hear the consoling voice of Mr. Harzow as he told us to both find a compromise, and that fighting was never the answer. I could hear Mom downstairs, her feet pounding up the hardwood, the sound of us fighting having galvanized her. Mom walked in just as Grandma dealt me a vicious slap across the cheek, rocking my head to the side and sending me sprawling to the floor. I can remember the two of them shouting at each other as easily as I can remember my favorite television show. They never came to blows, but it was very close a few times. Mom wanted to know just what the hell was going on. Grandma kept shrieking that she wanted us out, all the while clutching her murky television set. She said we were not welcome here anymore. She said she never wanted to see us again. She said that she would call the police if we didn't leave immediately. All the while, I could hear Mr. Harzow whispering for her not to do such a thing, for her to work out her problems, to reconcile with her loved ones. Far from making her see reason, hearing her voice only seemed to harden her resolve. Hearing his voice only made me want to bask in the glow of that murky television set all the more. Finally, we left, my mother weeping openly as she dragged me kicking and screaming down the stairs. That was the last time I heard his voice. For 12 years. You would say that after 12 years I might have forgotten about Mr. Harzow. You might think that after 12 years I would have surely moved on with my life. You might assume that I would find other hobbies and interests besides talking to a man that lives inside a VHS tape. You would be wrong. Dead wrong. When it became apparent that I couldn't get the tape back, I started searching. This was the early days of the internet, and I started furiously pursuing information online about similar tapes or similar programs. I didn't find much. There were a handful of people who were clearly just playing around, a few others who were trying to use the tape, and my obvious desire for it, to lure me into something terrible. Neither of these bothered me much, but the others showed me something I didn't want to see. Becky and Steven were two users I spoke to on a forum who believed they had actually come into contact with Mr. Harzow. Both had the kind of conversations with me that smack addicts likely had with each other. They spoke of their time with him lovingly, their words painting a picture of almost worshipful need. Becky said she had spent 10 years with Mr. Harzow before her mother had taken her television and thrown it out. She locked Becky in her room, and Becky had been forced to watch the truck come and take the TV, VHS and all away forever. Steven had a similar story, but his tape had been destroyed in a fire when his house had burned to the ground. That was 2 years ago when I found them, and I had no idea how much they would affect my search. About a year after meeting Steven, he stopped talking altogether. Becky and I assumed that something must have happened to him. He had been teetering lately, rolling in the memories of his time with Mr. Harzow, like a dog rolling in a smell it likes, and he had been talking about self-harm a lot. When he didn't sign on for about a week, Becky and I assumed he had finally had enough of dwelling on something that he couldn't have. His last message read, "I'll be with him soon." Becky, on the other hand, saw an opportunity that I never would have foreseen. She had been asking a lot of very loaded questions about where I lived, and more importantly, where my grandmother lived. You see, Grandma was still alive, even after 12 years of living under Mr. Harzow's watchful eye. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her, and she just sort of lived off her retirement and her slowly deteriorating house. I had walked by a few times, trying to find a way inside while she was away, but she never left. Her groceries were delivered, her mail spilled from her box, and she simply existed inside her crumbling tomb. I saw what Becky was after, and refused to tell her where she could find my tape. Becky, it seems, was more resourceful than I had thought, though. About a week ago, Mom got a call that Grandma had died. The police told us that someone had broken into her house, probably thinking it was abandoned, and found her in her bedroom. The two had fought, and despite her age, Grandma had strangled them to death. Her heart, however, wasn't quite as strong as her hands, and she had died with her fingers pressed into the flesh of the intruder. The intruder had been identified as Rebecca Smythe, a resident of California, who seemed to have driven 800 miles just to break into my grandmother's house. It seemed that my internet friend had finally pinpointed where my grandmother lived, and it had been the end of her. The night after the funeral, I made my move. I broke a window around back, we no longer had a key to the house, and made my way through the unfamiliar squalor. The house was a wreck, junk and garbage piled everywhere, and when I finally found the stairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. They were sagging, the wood groaning as I walked up them, but they were still intact, and my prize was within reach. The TV was on the nightstand, its soft glow illuminating the bed where Grandma had breathed her last. The tape sat in the murky light, like a red invitation or a jolly splash of blood. I've been holding it, feeling its red plastic in my fingers for nearly an hour, as I contemplate whether or not to slide it in. It's not a question of whether I will or not. I have missed Mr. Harzow desperately for the last 12 years, but I wanted to take down this story before I give my life back to him. You may think this is his fault somehow, but I cannot blame him for what has happened. He told my grandma on that long ago day to reconcile with us. He never told me to hurt anyone. He never told me to be unkind to anyone. I think that's why people seek him. When Mr. Harzow speaks, you feel as though he speaks only for you. He accepts you, no matter what, and that kind of power is intoxicating. The TV accepted the tape in just the same way it always had, and now he's smiling at me and welcoming me back as an old friend. I think I'll go speak with my old friend for a while. I think I'll go speak with him for the rest of my life. I ran into the house and slammed the door behind me. Looking around frantically, I called for my parents. At that moment, I became about 4 years old again. My fear congealed in my guts when I realized they weren't home. They were gone, out of town, wouldn't be back until tomorrow night. That's why I'd been staying at Billy's in the first place. That's why Billy was thump, thump, thump. "Open up, Johnny, I know you're in there," said a slurry voice, sing-songing the words as the owner tried to bowl the door down. I turned and shot the bolt before backing away from the front door as though it might bite me. The wood on the thick old door, solid enough to rattle the windows when it slammed, looked like it was bowing in as whatever was on the other side pushed at the wood. The door warped and twisted and suddenly seemed made of clear film as handprints imposed their image into it. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. My dad had said that door was a foot thick when he installed it, and now it was bending and warping like melted wax. It was too much. I ran into the kitchen and slammed the door. I threw a chair in front of it too, for good measure. After I was certain that I had jammed it in there good, I backed away slowly with wide, staring eyes. I jumped suddenly and shrieked like a tea kettle when my jeans-clad bottom came into contact with something solid. I felt stupid when I realized it was just the fridge. Even laughed a little, thinking maybe I'd exaggerated this whole thing. That's when I heard a terrible cracking sound coming from the living room. It was the sound of wood splintering as its dimensions are violated. He'd be through soon. He'd be through, and he'd have me. Patches would be through. Billy, Randall, Scotty, and I had been friends since we were young. We'd been inseparable, thick as thieves, and the terrors of our neighborhood since we were old enough to walk. Don't get me wrong or anything, we weren't bullies. We weren't bad boys. We had our vegetables. We were in before the streetlights came on. We kept our grades up. We were polite to anyone that we met. The problem was that we liked to play pranks. What child doesn't like to pull a prank now and then? Attack on a teacher's chair, a whoopee cushion on a classmate's seat, a frog in a backpack. We'd done them all, and it had given us a bit of a reputation as troublemakers. When school ended for the summer, and the four of us moved on to middle school, I'm pretty sure the teachers at our old elementary school threw a party to celebrate. We were all just looking forward to summer, a summer of pranks and mischief, but none of us could have foreseen what was to come. After 3 weeks of no school, limited parental supervision, and way too much free time on our hands, we started to get bored. We'd pulled some pranks. Putting mud in Miss Laverne's washing machine had almost gotten us caught, but most people were already wary of us because of our reputation as pranksters, so it was getting hard to pull a really good prank like we wanted. One afternoon, though, the four of us put our heads together and thought of all the people we hadn't pranked yet, and only one person in town came to mind: Patches. The front door crashed open like it had been shot with a cannon, but in the wake of the break-in, I was treated to nothing but a long silence from the living room. No footsteps headed towards the kitchen, no slurry voice trying to call me out. Just a long, uncomfortable silence as I sat with my back against the solid old refrigerator and waited to see what would happen. I counted in my head, 1, 2, 3, and when I got to 100, I worked my way up to my feet and took a hesitant step towards the kitchen door. That's when the knob started to turn frantically. It turned left, then right, then left again, and someone pushed against it and swore loudly when the chair stopped it from opening. He slammed against the lame barricade, and I saw one of his bloodshot eyes peek through the crack as it trained onto me. The eye went wide in mirth, and I heard the slurry voice call my name again. He rattled at the door a few more times before opening it as far as he could so I could hear him. Johnny, 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 Johnny. Don't you want to see what you did to your old pal Patches? Don't you want to see what you and your friends did to me? Maybe when I'm through this door, he slammed his weight against it again, I'll give you a taste of what I gave the others. Billy squealed like a little girl when I twisted his fat head right off his shoulders. He screamed through the door as he put his whole weight into the hit, and the legs of the chair started bucking as it got ready to give. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I tore up the stairs as fast as I could, taking the little staircase in the kitchen. Just as my feet touched the bottom step, I heard the door crash open, and I put on a burst of speed. As I hit the halfway point, something grabbed my ankle, and I fell hard onto the rough wooden steps. I bit my tongue on the way down, and felt my lips split as I hit the stairs. One look at what stood at the bottom, though, and both of those pains were nothing. His hand was wrapped in the same threadbare mittens he'd worn in life, and it clutched my ankle as it looked like his arm stretched from his body, so it hung halfway down the stairs behind him like a fire hose. Patches stood at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in his soiled, cast-off clothes, and grinned his gap-toothed smile, which had become decidedly moldy in death. He started pulling on me as I struggled to get back to my feet. Patches was a tramp, a sort of city pet, and the residents thought he gave our town a colorful appearance. They'd all grown up with Mayberry and Mayfield. Small towns were expected to have a friendly tramp who stole the occasional pie or was caught sleeping off a bottle at the bus station. Patches never stole any pies. He was welcome to a piece on the front porch of almost any house in town. But he was drunk most any old night of the week. He could be seen staggering out of Gemmer's and down to his camp by the river most any old night of the week. He never caused any trouble, though, and the police never felt the need to throw him in the drunk tank or hassle him at all. I would have called us friends at one time. Everybody in town hired Patches to do odd jobs for a little money now and then. He had a rusty old push mower that he'd used to cut people's grass with, and he claimed he'd been a handyman of some sort before the war. He had enough skill with tools to back it up, so most any afternoon he could be seen cutting grass or shoveling snow or fixing something for a few dollars to feed and medicate himself. Medicating is what Dad called it when Patches got drunk. Patches had laughed when I told him so. He fixed my bike tire once, and he'd taken Scotty Randall and I on a hike in the woods once when we had asked if he knew any good camping spots. He was a nice guy, sober or drunk, and I don't think I'd ever seen anyone in town have any trouble with him. We shouldn't have pranked him. It was wrong. I wish now that I could take it back. Pranking him had been Billy's idea, but we'd all gone along with it. Billy's dad owned the hardware store, and he was just about the only guy in town that didn't really trust Patches. Billy's dad headed out for tramps and vags, and he taught his son to be mindful of them as well. Tramps like a no-good dog pretending to be good. He'd tell us when he saw Patches wandering around, "You might pet him 100 times and not get bit, but when you take your eyes off him for half a heartbeat, he'll bite you." I didn't think Patches was like that. I thought he was a good guy. but we knew better than to argue with an adult, so we just nodded and said we'd be careful. Billy had a roach, the rubber kind that you got from the joke shop for a nickel, and he put it deep down in a corned beef sandwich and told me to take it over to Patches. "Why me?" I asked, not really wanting to prank Patches, but not wanting to seem chicken. "He trusts you. Your dad's always paying him to do stuff, and I've seen him talking to you on the front porch," Billy said. "He hasn't gotten work for a few days now, what with this heat, and he's probably getting hungry. He'll bite down on that sandwich and see the roach and freak out." We all laughed a little at the thought of Patches biting down on that roach and freaking out. We'd have all freaked out too if we found a roach in a sandwich. Afterwards, we'd all have a good laugh and find someone else to prank. He looked up from where he was sunning himself and smiled his gap-toothed smile at me. "Oh, well, hey there, Johnny-O. What you say, old sport?" he asked in his thick southern drawl. "Nothing much. My mom packed me a corned beef sandwich for lunch, but I'm not really a big fan of corned beef. I thought you might like it." I held the sandwich out to him and tried my best not to smile. Patches took the bait at once. "Oh, well, say there. That's mighty funny, old sport. Been here a day and a half since I had me any victuals." He took the sandwich and had a big bite, chewing with relish. "By the way, I saw Miss Laverne's washing machine." He slapped his knee as he gave a big donkey laugh. "I was 3 hours cleaning the mud out of that contraption. I guess I should thank you boys for the work." He laughed a little and took another bite, and when he did, I saw the gleaming head of the plastic roach sticking out of the sandwich. I started to point it out, but he kept right on laughing and telling me about the muddy washing machine and how hard it had been to get all the mud out of it. Apparently, he'd had to remove the drum and rinse it in the yard and then put the whole contraption back together. When he'd finished, and it was time to get paid, he took another bite and said through a mouthful of corned beef, "You know that old skinflint only gave me $1 for all that work. She tells me not to spend it all in one place." He brayed more laughter, but as he went to bite again, something happened. He wheezed a bit, his throat working to swallow the load of corned beef, and I realized with horror that he'd swallowed the plastic roach, too. The mat of corned beef and the hard plastic roach were stuck in his throat, and as he coughed and gasped, I realized he was choking. Billy, Randall, and Scotty broke cover and ran over to see what had happened, but by then, it was already too late. He had melted to his knees in the dirt, coughing his life out as the wad of half-chewed food hung like plaster in his throat. All the backslapping in the world wouldn't do anything for him. We sent Scotty and Randall to call an ambulance, but Patches was dead before they even left the riverside. His face was a dark purple color at the end as he clawed at his throat. Billy and I clapped him on the back again and again, but we might as well have been slapping a tree trunk. If you've never seen a man choke to death, then you may not know what it looks like, but I'm here to tell you that it's not as clean as it looks on TV. Patches hacked and coughed, tried to bring it up, clawed at his throat until his skin bled, and then, finally, he gave both of us a final look and pitched over onto his face, a look of terror and confusion stamped there forever. The hand gripped my ankle, and I could feel his fingers trying to twist it through the shoe. Maybe he meant to break it. Maybe he just wanted to make me hurt bad enough to let go. Whatever his intention, I wasn't about to play along. I twisted my foot a little and let the sneaker slip off as it slapped back into his palm like a rubber band. Patches howled in rage, but I wasn't going to give him a chance to recover. I sprinted up the stairs and slammed my door closed behind me. I shot the lock and pushed the desk in front of the door as I thought about how best to escape. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, but I needed a plan before I went. I grabbed my backpack from the closet and threw some clothes into it, taking the $10 out of my desk I'd been saving for a new bike and putting it in my pocket. I stuffed my scout sleeping bag in as well. I felt a surge of joy for half a second when I remembered my old rifle my dad had used for hunting ducks in the fall, but that joy withered when I remembered that it was locked up in my dad's gun safe in the basement. I settled for a Swiss Army knife and a little fire starter kit that Randall had given me for my birthday, and took one last look around. Some baseball cards went in. Maybe I could sell them. And a nice pocket watch my granddad had given me before I stopped and realized it was too quiet outside. Why wasn't he trying to get in? I put my hiking boots on and stuffed some socks into the bag before I slung it on and looked at the window. It would be a long drop to the ground, but I could hang off the kitchen roof and maybe not break my ankle if I was careful.
My eyes flicked back to the door, and for a moment, I felt the urge to fling it open and confront my attacker head on. The suicidal urge passed quickly, though, and I crept over to the door and laid my ear against it instead, trying to hear what might be going on the other side. The bang from the other side made me jump back in fright, and Patches laughed his donkey bray. "Ha ha ha ha! Come out, Johnny! There's no escape now!" The ambulance had come, and the paramedics had pronounced him DRT, dead right there. Warner Mads, the fat volunteer firefighter who was on paramedic duty that day, had laughed when he said it, but none of the rest of us found it very funny. We all watched them put him on the stretcher and cover him with a sheet before they slid him into the covered truck they used as an ambulance and took him to Porter's mortuary. We spent the next week in a state of pure dread. "What if they find that roach in his throat?" Randall would say as we tried to get back to normal. "What if they cut him open and find it, and they decide that we killed him?" Billy punched him in the arm after we had all ignored him for about the 1,000th time. "So what if they do? It's not like we meant to kill him. We just wanted to prank him, that's all." "But what?" Randall started, but Billy punched him again, and Randall knocked off so he could rub at his arm. "Shut up, Randy. If you keep talking about it, then someone's going to start asking questions. Why don't you guys come stay over at my house? My dad's working the late shift, and Johnny's parents are out of town, so he's staying with me anyway. We can have a sleepover and forget all about this crap." We all agreed that sounded like fun, and when the sun set Friday night, we were all sitting around a camp lantern in Billy's room telling scary stories. Billy had wanted a fire, but his dad had absolutely forbidden it, and so the best we could hope for was the small lantern on the floor of his room. His mom had gone to bed shortly after dinner, saying how tired she was, and we'd been left to our own devices for hours. We'd played games, watched a little TV in the living room, and raided the kitchen for snacks before finally deciding that it was time for the traditional scary stories. Billy got to tell the first one since it was his house, and he told us about an escaped asylum patient who'd killed the previous owner of this very house. He claimed that on quiet nights, you could still hear them begging for their lives and the almost inaudible sound of a man dragging his knife along the wall as he hunted for the last of the children in the house. Randy got pretty scared, but that was far from new. After Patches, he seemed to be scared by most everything. Thinking of Patches made me think of a story of my own to tell, but I hesitated and let Scotty go first. Scotty told a story about a skinned dog who killed a bunch of boys on a camping trip, and even though a skinned dog with bones poking out and his jaws full of slobber sounded a little scary, it was pretty stupid all told. When one of the boys managed to kill it and discovered that there was a whole pack of them that then ripped him to shreds, we all rolled our eyes and threw our pillows at him. He laughed and threw his back, and one pillow fight later, Billy asked if I had a story. "I do, actually, but it's not really a story. I thought I saw Patches the other day." Everyone went quiet. Randall looked like a goose had walked over his grave. Scotty sucked air through his teeth, and Billy punched me in the arm in a less than playful way. "That ain't funny, man. That ain't funny a little bit." But I told him I wasn't joking. I'd seen him on and off for days since his death. Pressed up against the glass of the grocery store, his gap teeth covered in mold and his face a purple and red patchwork. At his old camp when my dad and I drove past, and even when I didn't see him, I could swear I smelled the odor of peppermint candy and rock gut whiskey, the smells of Patches. But last night was the worst yet. I woke up all of a sudden and there was someone standing at the end of my bed. I thought it might be my dad, checking up on me, and then I smelled the peppermint and the sweet smell of alcohol, and I knew who it was. I didn't say anything, but he smiled at me from the foot of my bed, and his mossy teeth glinted in the moonlight. "That was a rotten trick, Johnny," he whispered, and his voice was hoarse and cracking. "Maybe I'll come play a trick on you boys sometime. See how you like it. Sleep tight then." Then I blinked, and he was just gone. They all sat there gape-mouthed for a heartbeat or two, and then Randall started laughing. It wasn't real laughter, not really, but the crazy, jagged laughter that people make when they're scared and they don't know what else to do. He reached out and grabbed a big handful of popcorn and said, "Good one, Johnny. as he stuffed it into his mouth and kept laughing. The laughs turned into gasps, though, as he started to choke on the popcorn. The three of us got up, wanting to stop him before he choked to death, but as he knelt hacking, we could see his hands clawing not at his throat, but at the black-gloved hands wrapped around his neck. Patches had leaned around the back of his head then, grinning like a monster in a movie, and Randall's clutching hands had died like two birds in their death throes. We backed away from him, not sure what to make of this grisly phantom, and he stood to his full height so he could tower over us. Randall lay still on the floor then, his coughing done, and the three of us silently wondered who would be next.
"So, Billy, you like roaches, do you?" the cadaverous thing asked,
turning towards the terrified boy who stood frozen to the spot.
"Well, here then. Have some, won't you?"
Billy gagged, and a single glistening roach fell from his lips. He stared at it dumbly before he retched, and a cascade of them pattered to the floor and scattered like roaches. He went to all fours and kept vomiting up the glistening insects, his body racked with sobs and heaves as Patches laughed merrily over his handiwork. It was too much. I bolted for the door and never saw what happened to Scotty. I threw open the living room door and ran out into the night, but I could hear the laughter of that mad apparition behind me as I fled for the safety of home. I believed, in my youth, in the talismanic protection of home, and as Patches dogged my heels, I could see it getting closer and closer before me. I found my keys and rammed them into the lock, and as the door closed behind me, I was certain I was safe. Sitting in my room now, I realized I would never be safe again. Sitting on my sleeping bag and writing this down, I realized I haven't been safe for the last 20 years. I fled that night with my backpack and my fear, and God forgive me, I never looked back. I later found out that the deaths of my three friends were the talk of the small town, and many believed that I had been abducted by whoever had done the killing. I used the money I had to get as far away as I could from my hometown, and when it was gone, I worked for men who would hire a boy my age to do a day's work. This was 1974, so there were kids on the run all over, and one more didn't really strike much interest. When I couldn't work, I begged, and when I found someone willing to take me in for a few days, I stayed. Eventually, though, I would have to move on again or risk being caught in the shadow of Patches. Patches didn't stay in my hometown after all. No matter where I went, I would see him somewhere eventually, reflected in the window of a store, half hidden in an alley between two buildings. Sometimes I'd smell that sickly sweet smell of him and know it was time to get a move on. I took up the bottle early, and as I got older, I came to realize that in my own sad way, I had become Patches. I'd become a living monument to the man I had killed on accident, and I suppose I was just looking for a place like my hometown where I could feel safe. I guess I found it now. The truck dropped me off by the familiar river I had so often swam in when I was young, and as the sun set, I found the ragged remains of Patches' old camp. The town has changed, as I knew it would, and the attendant at the corner store gave me a dirty look as I used my last $5 to pick up a bottle of Irish Rose whiskey. I didn't care. By tomorrow, I'd just be another curiosity piece in the local paper. Homeless man found murdered by the river, it would likely say. And after 20 years of running, I guess that's not too bad. The bottle's half gone now. So was the sun as I sit here making my final notes. I'm sitting in the spot where his camp used to be, and the sounds of the river, the frogs, and the crickets just tuning up behind me are almost soothing as I wait for my death to come. He'll find me now, I'm sure of it, and after all this time, it's almost a relief. A shadow has fallen over me, and a familiar voice asks,
"You gonna finish that bottle, Johnny?"
I looked up into the unchanging face of horror. I hand it up to him and smile. "Guess not."